Power tripping is a dangerous game when played against the very person who writes the rules. Airports frequently bring out the absolute worst in people, magnifying tiny amounts of authority until that power warps into blinding cruelty. When a seasoned gate supervisor decided to publicly humiliate a quiet passenger at gate C14 solely based on the color of his skin, he firmly believed he was simply asserting dominance. He had no idea his chosen victim was quietly holding the keys to his entire career. What followed was a masterclass in patience, a shocking phone call from corporate headquarters and a devastating wave of immediate karma that left an entire terminal completely speechless. Fluorescent lights buzzed with a low, oppressive hum over the sprawling expanse of Chicago O'Hare's Terminal 3. It was a chaotic Friday evening, the kind of evening where the air felt thick with the collective anxiety of delayed travelers, spilled coffee, and the frantic rolling of oversized luggage. At Gate C14, Vanguard Airlines Flight 882 to London Heathrow was preparing for boarding. It was a flagship route flying the massive Boeing 777, heavily booked with corporate executives, politicians, and wealthy vacationers. Arthur Pendleton stood behind the main podium, adjusting the gold-plated name tag pinned perfectly to his crisp navy uniform. Arthur was the senior gate supervisor for Vanguard, a title he wore not just as a badge of employment but as a crown. Having spent 22 years working his way up from baggage handling, Arthur had developed a rigid, unyielding view of how the world should operate, and more specifically, who belonged in which designated lines. He prided himself on his intuition, a thinly veiled cover for deep-seated prejudices that he masked as security diligence. His eyes, narrowed and calculating, scanned the crowded waiting area. The first-class lounge overflow had spilled out into the main gate seating, a mix of tailored suits and expensive leather carry-ons. And then Arthur's gaze stopped abruptly. Sitting in a corner seat near the priority boarding lane was David Carmichael. David was a tall, broad-shouldered black man in his late 40s. He wasn't wearing a bespoke Italian suit or flashing a gaudy luxury watch. Instead, David wore a well-fitted, understated dark gray hoodie, comfortable dark denim jeans, and a pair of clean, unobtrusive sneakers. A leather duffel bag rested casually at his feet. He was quietly reading a thick, leather-bound notebook, completely minding his own business, sipping from a standard paper coffee cup. To anyone else, David was just another weary traveler waiting for a transatlantic flight. To Arthur Pendleton, David was a glaring anomaly. Arthur's jaw tightened. He leaned over to the junior gate agent, a nervous young woman named Chloe. "Look over there," Arthur muttered, nodding his head toward David's direction. "Seat 4A on the manifest. Have you checked his documents?"
Oh, that's thought. How true.
Chloe blinked, looking at her screen and then toward the seating area. "You mean the gentleman in the gray sweater?" "No, Arthur. He scanned his digital boarding pass at the lounge entrance earlier. Everything came up green. He's booked in first class." "I don't care what the computer says," Arthur scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. "People figure out how to spoof those digital passes all the time. Look at him. Does he look like he belongs in a $12,000 lie-flat suite to London? He's probably trying to poach an empty seat or sneaked into the priority area." "Arthur, he's not doing anything wrong," Chloe whispered, her voice laced with discomfort. She knew Arthur's reputation. He had a documented history of randomly selecting specific demographics for secondary gate checks, a practice human resources had warned him about but never outright penalized him for, thanks to his union seniority. "I have an eye for these things, Chloe," Arthur said dismissively, his tone dripping with unearned superiority. "Vanguard is a premium airline. We have a standard to uphold for our high-paying clientele. I'm not going to let some scammer slip onto my aircraft and make our VIPs uncomfortable." Across the terminal, David Carmichael slowly turned a page in his notebook. He was utterly unaware of the target that had just been painted on his back. David was exhausted. Past 4 months had been a whirlwind of endless meetings, closed-door negotiations, and grueling financial audits. He was looking forward to a quiet, uninterrupted 8-hour flight to London to finally catch up on some sleep. He preferred dressing down when he flew. He found suits restricted in pressurized cabins, and he had absolutely nothing to prove to anyone. Arthur stepped out from behind the podium, his posture rigid, his face set in a scowl of self-appointed authority. He began pacing the carpeted area near the first-class boarding lane, occasionally shooting glaring, highly visible looks directly at David. He wanted the man to feel uncomfortable. He wanted him to squirm, but David didn't squirm. When he finally looked up and caught Arthur staring, David simply offered a polite, brief nod, took a sip of his coffee, and returned to his reading. That polite dismissal infuriated Arthur. It was a quiet confidence that Arthur immediately interpreted as arrogance. In Arthur's mind, a man like that should be deferential, nervous, aware that he was out of his element. The fact that David was completely at ease in the luxury boarding area triggered a vindictive fuse within the gate supervisor. "All right, ladies and gentlemen," the automated terminal voice echoed through the overhead speakers. "Vanguard Airlines Flight 882 to London Heathrow is now ready to begin the boarding process. We will begin with our first-class passengers and Vanguard Diamond Elite members."
Tough.
Arthur marched back to the podium, grabbing the microphone. "First class only," he barked into the mic, his voice unnecessarily loud. "If you are not first class, remain in your seats. We are checking all boarding passes and identification at the podium today." Chloe looked at him, startled. "Arthur, corporate policy changed last month. We don't need to match ID at the gate for international anymore if they cleared TSA and the facial recognition terminal." "My gate, my rules," Arthur snapped coldly. "Watch and learn." David Carmichael closed his notebook, carefully sliding it into the side pocket of his leather duffel bag. He stood up, stretching his legs, and joined the small, quiet line forming at the priority boarding lane. Ahead of him was a middle-aged white couple in expensive cashmere coats, and behind him stood a young tech executive aggressively typing on his phone. The couple approached the podium. Arthur beamed at them, his previous scowl instantly replaced by a wide, obsequious smile. "Welcome back, Mr. and Mrs. Henderson. Always a pleasure to have you flying with Vanguard. Have a wonderful flight to London." He barely glanced at their phones as they tapped them against the scanner. The machine beeped a cheerful green. Then David stepped forward. The moment David was in front of him, Arthur's fake smile vanished, replaced by a hard, suspicious glare. He physically stepped out from behind the podium, blocking the pathway to the Jeckridge with his body. "Boarding pass?" Arthur demanded. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't say please. The tone was sharp, commanding, and loud enough for the people behind David to hear clearly. David paused for a fraction of a second, registering the immediate, hostile shift in the employee's demeanor. He had experienced this kind of microaggression countless times throughout his life, though it had become rarer in recent years. Still, he kept his expression perfectly neutral. He held up his smartphone, the screen displaying his digital boarding pass with a massive first-class ACET-4A clearly visible across the top. He moved to tap it against the scanner, but Arthur quickly placed his hand over the glass of the machine. "I need to see a paper ticket," Arthur stated firmly. "A paper ticket?" David asked, his voice calm, deep, and steady. Vanguard transitioned to fully digital boarding passes for international priority passengers 3 weeks ago. The app generates a dynamic QR code specifically to prevent fraud. Arthur's eyes narrowed. The fact that this man knew Vanguard's internal policy updates irritated him even further. "I am aware of our policies, sir. However, due to recent security concerns regarding fraudulent digital passes, I am requiring secondary verification." "Step out of the line, please." The tech executive behind David sighed loudly, checking his watch. Is there an issue with my digital pass? David asked, remaining rooted in his spot. You didn't ask the couple ahead of me for a paper ticket. I know them, Arthur lied smoothly. I don't know you, and frankly, this lane is for first-class passengers. Are you sure you aren't supposed to be in Zone 5? The blatant insult hung heavily in the air. Chloe, the junior agent, visibly cringed behind the computer monitor. Several passengers in the nearby seating area turned their heads to watch the unfolding drama. David's eyes hardened, locking onto Arthur's name tag. Arthur Pendleton, Senior Gate Supervisor. David filed the name away in his impeccable memory. My boarding pass clearly states first class, Arthur, David said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its conversational warmth but maintaining strict professional courtesy. I have my passport right here. You can match the name on the digital pass to my government-issued identification. No. David reached into his pocket and pulled out his dark blue passport, opening it to the photo page and holding it out. Arthur didn't take it. Instead, he leaned in closer. Listen to me very carefully, Arthur hissed, dropping his voice so only David and the immediate passengers could hear. I don't know how you got access to that digital pass. Maybe you bought it online, maybe you stole a frequent flyer login. But men like you don't fly first class on Vanguard. Now you are holding up my line. You are going to step aside or I am going to have you forcibly removed from this terminal. David did not break eye contact. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood taller, his commanding presence effortlessly dwarfing Arthur's petty authority. Men like me, David repeated, emphasizing the word slowly. Could you clarify what you mean by that, Arthur? You know exactly what I mean, Arthur sneered. Now move. Now, David replied simply. I am a paying passenger on this airline. I have presented a valid boarding pass and a valid passport. You are obstructing my entry to the aircraft based on a personal, unfounded bias. I request that you scan my pass and let me board. Arthur's face flushed a deep, ugly shade of crimson. He was not used to being defied, especially not so calmly. When passengers usually got angry, they yelled, giving him the perfect excuse to claim they were unruly and deny them boarding. David's absolute ice-cold composure was a weapon Arthur didn't know how to fight. Chloe, Arthur barked over his shoulder, never taking his eyes off David. Call airport security. Tell them we have a hostile passenger attempting to breach the jet bridge. Arthur, please, Chloe stammered, terrified. The scanner is working. I can just override. Call them right now. Arthur shouted, his voice echoing through the gate area. The entire boarding process ground to a halt. Murmurs erupted from the growing line of first-class and business-class passengers. Some looked at David with sympathy, recognizing exactly what was happening. Others, annoyed by the delay, glared at him, assuming he must have done something wrong to warrant such a reaction. David looked at Chloe, offering her a brief, reassuring glance. It's okay, he told her softly. Go ahead and call them. He then turned his attention back to Arthur. You are making a catastrophic mistake, David said, his tone devoid of anger, sounding almost entirely like a factual statement. I highly recommend you process my ticket and allow me to board. Once security arrives, this situation leaves your control and the consequences will be entirely yours to bear. Are you threatening me? Arthur puffed up his chest. That's a federal offense. It's not a threat, David replied smoothly. It is an observation of corporate liability. Within 3 minutes, the heavy footfalls of heavy boots echoed down the concourse. 2 airport security officers, clad in high-visibility yellow and tactical vests, aggressively pushed their way through the crowd of onlookers. Leading the pair was Officer Gregory Lawson, a man built like a fire hydrant with a chronically aggressive disposition. Lawson and Arthur had a history. They frequently drank at the same airport bar after shifts, sharing a mutual disdain for the general public. What's the problem here, Artie? Mate, Larson asked loudly, immediately resting his hand on his utility belt in a display of intimidation. Arthur pointed a trembling finger at David. This man is refusing to comply with gate procedures. He presented a suspicious digital boarding pass, refused to provide secondary paper verification, and is now causing a disturbance and threatening me. He's blocking the boarding lane. Larson immediately turned his aggressive posture toward David. He stepped uncomfortably close, invading David's personal space. "All right, buddy. Fun's over," Larson growled. "Grab your bag. You're coming with us." David did not flinch. He looked at Larson with the same detached, analytical gaze he had used on Arthur. "Officer, I have done nothing to violate airport protocol or airline policy. I provided my valid passport and my authorized digital ticket. The gate supervisor is refusing to scan it based on personal prejudice." "I don't care about your excuses," Larson snapped, grabbing David forcefully by the upper arm. "When an airline representative tells you, you aren't flying, you aren't flying. Now pick up the bag before I put you on the ground." A collective gasp rippled through the gathered passengers. A woman near the front of the line pulled out her smartphone and began recording. David looked down at Larson's hand gripping his arm. The grip was tight, meant to hurt. "Remove your hand from my person," David said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. It was the voice of a man who commanded boardrooms, a man who fired executives for lesser infractions. "I am fully willing to walk with you to clear this up, but if you do not remove your hand, I will press formal battery charges against you and the airport authority." Larson hesitated. There was something profoundly intimidating about David's total lack of fear. Usually people panicked, yelled, or tried to pull away. David just stood there, an immovable object. Reluctantly, Larson let go of the arm, but stepped even closer to David's back. "Walk," Larson commanded, pointing toward a solid, unmarked gray door located near the restrooms, a temporary holding and interrogation room used by security. "Gladly," David replied. He calmly reached down, picked up his leather duffel bag, and began walking toward the door. As they walked through the terminal, Arthur couldn't resist a final jab. He grabbed his microphone. "We apologize for the delay, ladies and gentlemen. Vanguard Airlines takes your safety very seriously, and we will not tolerate fraudulent or hostile behavior at our gates. Boarding will resume immediately." David heard the announcement. He felt the eyes of hundreds of passengers burning into his back. He was being paraded like a criminal, publicly humiliated in front of peers, colleagues, and strangers. The sheer indignity of it was suffocating. Yet as he walked, his mind was not clouded by rage. It was sharp with crystal-clear focus. He followed Larson into the small, windowless gray room. It smelled faintly of old sweat and ammonia. A metal table sat in the center with 2 plastic chairs. "Sit," Larson ordered, pointing to a chair. David ignored the order. He remained standing, placing his duffel bag gently on the metal table. "Before we go any further, Officer Larson," David said, reading the man's name off his tactical vest, "I want to be very clear. I am going to make one phone call. I suggest you allow me to make it."
"Not
"You don't get phone calls right now," the second officer sneered, stepping into the room and closing the heavy door behind them. "You're detained pending an investigation into fraudulent ticketing and terroristic threats against airline personnel." Terroristic threats? David actually let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "Fascinating. The escalation of lies is truly remarkable to witness firsthand." "Empty your pockets. Put your phone on the table," Larson demanded, ignoring David's words. David reached into his pocket and slowly withdrew his smartphone. He did not put it on the table. Instead, he unlocked the screen with his thumb. "I said put it on the table," Larson barked, taking a step forward. "Officer Larson," David said, locking his dark eyes onto the security guard, "my name is David Carmichael. If you lay a hand on me again, or if you attempt to take my property, you will not only lose your job by midnight tonight, but you will find yourself in federal court by Monday morning. I am making my call. Without waiting for a response, David tapped a contact labeled simply HQ Priority Direct and brought the phone to his ear. Larson paused, exchanging a confused, slightly nervous glance with his partner. The sheer, overwhelming confidence of the man was disarming. Criminals bluffed, but this didn't feel like a bluff. This felt like a trap springing shut. The phone rang twice before it was answered on the other end. "Carmichael," a crisp, professional voice answered through the earpiece. It was Richard Hughes, the Global Director of Security and Operations for the Vanguard Aviation Conglomerate, sitting in a glass-walled office in Atlanta. "Richard," David spoke calmly into the phone, though the absolute coldness in his voice made the temperature in the small holding room seem to drop 10 degrees. "I need you to pull up the live security feed for Chicago O'Hare, Terminal 3, 8C14. Right now." Pulling it up, Richard replied immediately, sensing the severe tone. Keys clacked rapidly over the line. "I have it. What am I looking for?" "You are looking at an empty gate podium where I should currently be boarding my flight to London," David said, his eyes fixed dead on Larson, who was slowly beginning to realize he might have stepped on a landmine. "I want you to identify the senior gate supervisor currently working that desk. His name is Arthur Pendleton." "Got him," Richard confirmed. "I see him on the feed." "Excellent," David said. "Now, Richard, I need you to initiate immediate, catastrophic disciplinary protocol. Terminate his employment effective this exact second. Revoke his security clearance, lock his system access, and notify the local station manager to have him escorted off airport property without severance." Larson's jaw dropped. The second officer stepped back, suddenly looking incredibly pale. "Done," Richard said without a single second of hesitation. "Care to tell me what happened, David?" Mr. First thing she truly noticed, Pendleton decided to play a game of racial profiling at the first-class boarding lane, David explained, his voice echoing cleanly off the cinder-block walls. "He refused to scan my digital pass, accused me of fraud, and then had me publicly escorted away by 2 airport security officers who are currently holding me in a back room under completely fabricated charges of terroristic threats." There was a profound, heavy silence on the other end of the line. "David," Richard's voice was completely horrified. "Are you all right?" "I'm perfectly fine, Richard," David said, his gaze dropping to Larson's trembling hands. "But I suspect several other people are about to have the worst night of their lives." "Not much. Not so." The silence in the windowless interrogation room was absolute, heavy enough to crush the air out of the 2 airport security guards. Officer Gregory Larson stood frozen, his hand still hovering nervously near his utility belt. The aggressive swagger that had defined him just 5 minutes ago had entirely evaporated, replaced by a cold, creeping dread that settled in the pit of his stomach. Through the speaker of the smartphone resting in David's hand, the furious typing of Richard Hughes echoed from Vanguard's global headquarters in Atlanta. "David," Richard's voice returned, tight with a mixture of shock and corporate rage. "I'm looking at the personnel log for O'Hare Terminal 3 right now. There is no one named Arthur Pendleton scheduled on shift. In fact, Arthur Pendleton retired from Vanguard 2 years ago. I cross-referenced the live facial recognition feed. The man at gate C14 is Thomas Briggs." David's eyebrow arched slightly. A dark, fascinating twist. "Is that so?" "He is operating a flagship gate wearing the credentials of a retired employee." "Exactly," Richard confirmed, his tone turning deadly serious. "Briggs has a file thick with passenger complaints regarding discrimination and verbal abuse. He'd been dodging HR investigations for months because the complaints always named Arthur or Mr. Pendleton. He's been using stolen badge to commit civil rights violations without facing the consequences." Larson swallowed hard, the sound audible in the quiet room. He realized with horrifying clarity that he hadn't just detained an innocent man. He had aided and abetted a rogue airline employee in a targeted, premeditated act of malice. "Richard," David said, his eyes locking onto Larson, who was now visibly trembling, I want you to patch this call through to the personal cell phone of the Chief of Chicago Department of Aviation Police. Right now, you have his direct line. Patching through, Richard said instantly. Larson finally found his voice, though it cracked pathetically. Sir, listen, buddy. Let's just calm down. Maybe there was a misunderstanding. We were just following orders from the gate desk. We can let you go right now, no harm, no foul. You can catch your flight. No harm, no foul. David repeated softly, tilting his head. You assaulted me in front of a terminal full of people. You illegally detained me without cause, acting as the personal enforcement arm for a racist coward hiding behind a fake name tag. There is a great deal of harm, Officer Larson, and the foul has just begun. The phone clicked, and a deep, sleep-gruffened voice answered. Chief Miller. Chief Miller, this is Richard Hughes, Director of Global Operations for Vanguard Airlines, and I have David Carmichael on the line with me. There was a sudden shuffling sound on the other end as Chief Miller evidently sat straight up in bed. Mr. Carmichael. Sir, this is an unexpected honor. To what do I owe the pleasure?
Not outsold. I not.
Larson's partner, the second security guard, took a slow, terrified step backward until his shoulder blades hit the cinder block wall. Even the low-level guards knew who David Carmichael was. He wasn't just a wealthy passenger. David Carmichael was the billionaire venture capitalist whose private equity firm had just purchased a 60% controlling stake in Vanguard Aviation conglomerate 72 hours prior. The acquisition hadn't even been announced to the public yet. It was slated for a Monday morning press release. David Carmichael owned the airline. He owned the planes, he owned the gate leases, and his firm heavily subsidized the very airport authority that signed Larson's paychecks. Chief Miller, David spoke, his voice maintaining its chilling professional calm. I am currently being illegally held in a temporary detention room near Gate C-14 by 2 of your private security contractors. They grabbed me, threatened me, and removed me from my flight at the behest of a Vanguard employee who is operating under a fraudulent identity. I am auditing my new airline's flagship route, and this is the security apparatus I am met with. You are where? Chief Miller roared, the sound blasting through the phone speaker. Room 3B, Concourse C, David replied seamlessly. I expect you to send your official sworn officers down here immediately. I want these 2 contractors, stripped of their credentials, and I want a full criminal investigation opened into Thomas Briggs at Gate C-14. If my requests are not met within 5 minutes, I will pull Vanguard's corporate leases from Terminal 3 and move our hub to Dallas by the end of the fiscal year. Mr. Carmichael, stay right there. I am dispatching my captain and an armed unit right now. I deeply apologize. David ended the call. He slipped his phone back into his pocket and looked at the 2 ruined men standing before him. You told me I didn't get a phone call, David stated, his dark eyes devoid of any sympathy. It seems you were mistaken. Larson fell back into one of the plastic chairs, burying his face in his hands. The aggressive enforcer was gone, replaced by a man who had just watched his pension, his career, and his freedom vanish in the span of 3 minutes. David didn't gloat. He simply stood perfectly still, waiting for the real authorities to arrive. The trap had closed. Now it was time for the execution. Back out in the bustling terminal, the atmosphere at Gate C-14 was returning to normal. Boarding had resumed. The line of first-class passengers had funneled down the jet bridge, and Thomas Briggs, still wearing his polished, stolen Arthur Pendleton name tag, was feeling tremendously smug. He tapped keys on his terminal with a renewed sense of vigor. Taking down a man who thought he was untouchable always gave Thomas a rush of adrenaline. In his twisted mind, he was the gatekeeper of high society, protecting the sanctity of the premium cabin from those who didn't fit his narrow, bigoted aesthetic. He had done it a dozen times before, and hiding behind the retired supervisor's badge meant he was a ghost to the corporate HR department. It was the perfect system. Zone 2 you may now board, Thomas announced over the microphone, projecting an aura of total control. Junior Agent Chloe stood a few feet away, her stomach tied in agonizing knots. She had seen the way Thomas targeted that passenger. She knew it was wrong, but she was terrified of the Union retaliation if she spoke against a senior agent. She kept her head down, scanning tickets, praying the shift would just end. Suddenly, the low hum of the terminal was pierced by the sharp, authoritative beep of an airport security car. But this wasn't a standard yellow cart used by the private contractors. This was a dark blue heavy-duty cart belonging to the Chicago Department of Aviation Police. Its red and blue emergency lights were flashing, casting chaotic shadows across the high ceilings of the concourse. The cart screeched to a halt right in front of the Gate C-14 seating area, effectively blocking the main aisle. Passengers stopped in their tracks. The boarding line went dead silent. 4 fully uniformed, armed police officers stepped off the cart. Accompanying them was a woman in a sharp gray business suit, her face pale and her jaw set with absolute fury. It was Sarah Jenkins, the chief station manager for Vanguard at O'Hare. She was the highest-ranking executive on the property, and she looked like she was marching to a war zone. Thomas Briggs looked up, his smug smile faltering for a fraction of a second before he plastered on his best customer service face. "Sarah, good evening. We had a slight disruption earlier, but I handled it. Boarding is proceeding on schedule." Sarah didn't say a word. She marched straight behind the podium, completely ignoring professional pleasantries. She reached out and violently yanked the microphone cord out of its socket, killing the public address system. "Hey, what are you doing?" Thomas protested, stepping back. "Shut your mouth, Thomas," Sarah hissed, her voice vibrating with barely contained rage. The use of his real name hit Thomas like a physical blow. His eyes widened, darting nervously toward the 4 armed police officers who had fanned out, creating a secure perimeter around the podium. The passengers in line watched with bated breath, sensing the massive shift in power. I don't know what you're talking about, Sarah," Thomas stammered, instinctively covering the Arthur Pendleton name tag with his hand. "It's Arthur. Drop the act," Sarah commanded, her voice slicing through the air. "Corporate security in Atlanta has been watching you on the live feed for the last 15 minutes. They know about the badge, they know about the false complaints, and they know exactly what you just did." Thomas's face drained of color, turning a sickly, ashen gray. "I was following security protocols. That passenger was hostile. He had a fake digital pass. I was protecting the aircraft." "That passenger," a deep, resonant voice echoed from the concourse corridor. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. Walking down the center of the terminal, flanked by the captain of the aviation police and 2 more officers, was David Carmichael. He carried his leather duffel bag effortlessly over one shoulder. His posture was impeccable, his face a mask of absolute terrifying calm. He no longer looked like a tired traveler. He looked like a king returning to reclaim a stolen throne. Thomas felt his knees go weak. The man he had humiliated, the man he had sent to an interrogation room, was walking back with a police escort fit for a head of state. David stopped in front of the podium. He looked down at Thomas not with anger but with the cold, clinical assessment of a surgeon observing a tumor. "That passenger," David finished Sarah's sentence, his voice carrying clearly to the dozens of onlookers, "is the incoming chairman of the board and majority owner of the Vanguard Aviation conglomerate. You did not protect the aircraft, Mr. Briggs. You assaulted the man who owns it." A collective, stunned silence swept over Gate C-14. The businessman in the boarding line actually dropped his briefcase, the leather slapping loudly against the carpet. Chloe, the junior agent, gasped and covered her mouth with both hands, tears of pure shock welling in her eyes. Thomas Briggs couldn't breathe. The air felt like wet cement in his lungs. His career, his arrogant little kingdom, was collapsing in real time, broadcast to the very people he had tried to impress. "Mr. Carmichael, I I had no idea, Thomas choked out, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine. The power-tripping predator was entirely gone, replaced by a sniveling coward. If I had known who you were, if you had known who I was, you would have treated me with respect, David interrupted, his tone razor-sharp. Which proves my exact point. You reserve basic human dignity only for those you perceive to have power. You weaponize your tiny fraction of authority to humiliate people who don't look like your preferred clientele. You are a liability, a bigot, and a fraud. David turned slightly toward Sarah Jenkins. Miss Jenkins, is this man still an employee of my airline? No, Mr. Carmichael, Sarah stated firmly, turning to Thomas. Thomas Briggs, your employment is terminated effectively immediately, with cause. You will receive no severance, and your pension is frozen pending a criminal investigation into identity fraud and civil rights violations. You can't do this. The union will protect me. Thomas shrieked, panic finally breaking through his paralysis. The union, David said quietly, was informed of your stolen badge 10 minutes ago. They have already declined to represent you. You are entirely on your own. David nodded to the police captain. The captain stepped forward, unhooking handcuffs from his belt. Thomas Briggs, you are under arrest for identity theft, fraudulent impersonation of an airline official, and filing false police reports. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. As the cold steel clicked around Thomas's wrists, the illusion of his power shattered completely. He began to sob, a pathetic, wet sound that echoed in the quiet terminal. The police officers practically had to drag him away from the podium, his legs giving out as they frog-marched him through the crowd of staring, whispering passengers. Hard Karma had not just knocked on his door, it had kicked it down and dragged him out into the street. David watched him go, his expression unreadable. He then turned his attention to Chloe, who was shaking violently behind the computer monitors. David's demeanor instantly softened. The ice melted, replaced by a gentle, reassuring warmth. Chloe, isn't it? He asked softly. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Mr. Carmichael. I'm so sorry. I wanted to scan your pass. I really did. I know you did, David said kindly. I saw you try to intervene. You were put in an impossible position by an abusive manager. You were not at fault here. He looked at Sarah Jenkins. Miss Jenkins, please ensure Chloe is permitted to see a gate agent by Monday morning. She understands customer service far better than her predecessor. Chloe burst into tears of relief, nodding her head vigorously. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Now, David said, turning back to the shocked passengers who were still standing in the boarding line. He offered them a polite, charismatic smile. I apologize for the theatrical delay, ladies and gentlemen. Please, let's get you all comfortably seated. I believe we have a flight to London to catch. The atmosphere inside the first-class cabin of Vanguard Flight 82 was noticeably charged, a stark contrast to the usual hushed, detached elegance that defined transatlantic premium travel. As passengers settled into their expansive, privacy-doored suites, hushed whispers rippled through the aisles. Eyes covertly darted towards Suite 4A. The man who had been subjected to such severe public humiliation just 20 minutes prior was now the indisputable center of gravity for the entire aircraft. David Carmichael stepped onto the Boeing 777 with the quiet grace of a man entirely comfortable in his own skin. He stowed his leather duffel bag in the overhead compartment, taking his seat in the plush, custom-stitched leather chair. He did not look triumphant or gloating. His expression remained perfectly neutral, his focus already shifting back to the dense pages of the leather-bound notebook he had been reading in the terminal. A senior flight attendant, a dignified woman named Beatrice who had flown with Vanguard for 3 decades, approached Suite 4A carrying a silver tray. Resting on the tray was a crystal glass of sparkling water and a warm, damp towel, presented on a porcelain saucer. Her hands, usually perfectly steady, exhibited a microscopic tremor as she offered the tray. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Carmichael," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a respectful, highly discreet murmur. It is an absolute honor to have you flying with us this evening. On behalf of the entire flight crew, I want to personally apologize for the unacceptable distress you experienced at the gate." David looked up, offering Beatrice a genuine, warm smile that completely transformed his formidable presence. "Thank you, Beatrice, but there is absolutely no need for you to apologize. The actions of one rogue individual do not reflect the hard work of the dedicated crew on this aircraft. I am very much looking forward to a quiet flight. We will ensure you are entirely undisturbed, sir," Beatrice promised, bowing her head slightly before retreating to the galley. Before the heavy aircraft doors were sealed for departure, David retrieved his smartphone. He had dealt with the immediate threat of Thomas Briggs, but David Carmichael did not build a multi-billion-dollar private equity empire by leaving loose ends. Systemic rot required a systemic cure, and the private security contractors who had so eagerly participated in his illegal detainment were the next target of his precise administrative wrath. He dialed the direct line of Benjamin Hayes, the chief executive officer of Aegis Terminal Solutions, the massive private security firm contracted by the Chicago Department of Aviation. The phone rang for a mere 3 seconds before it was answered. News traveled at the speed of light in corporate aviation circles, and the catastrophic events at Gate C-14 had already triggered alarm bells across multiple corporate headquarters. "Mr. Carmichael?" Benjamin Hayes answered, his voice thick with carefully concealed panic. "I was just drafting an urgent email to your office. I have been fully briefed on the completely inexcusable conduct of 2 of our contractors. I want to assure you personally that—" "Save the corporate platitudes, Benjamin," David interrupted, his tone chillingly smooth. "I do not deal in assurances. I deal in consequences. 10 minutes ago, 2 of your uniformed men put their hands on me, threatened me with fabricated federal charges, and locked me in a windowless room to appease a racist airline employee. They operated without oversight, without cause, and with a shocking degree of brutal entitlement. They have already been suspended pending a full internal review, David. I swear to you we will terminate them the moment the review concludes." "A suspension is a vacation," David corrected him coldly. "Here are my terms, Benjamin, and you will execute them before my flight leaves Chicago airspace. Officer Gregory Larson and his partner are to be terminated with cause immediately. Furthermore, Aegis Terminal Solutions will permanently surrender its security contract with Vanguard Airlines across all 64 domestic hubs, effective at midnight tonight." There was a horrifying gasp on the other end of the line. The Vanguard contract represented a massive percentage of Aegis' annual revenue. Losing it would cripple the firm's quarterly projections and send their stock price into a violent tailspin. "David, please be reasonable," Benjamin pleaded, the professional veneer shattering. "You cannot punish the entire corporation for the rogue actions of 2 low-level contractors. We have thousands of dedicated employees. Stripping the contract will cost hundreds of innocent people their jobs. Then you should have implemented better training protocols, Benjamin," David countered, utterly unmoved by the emotional appeal. "A security firm that employs thugs who act as personal enforcers for bigots is a security firm I refuse to finance. You allowed a culture of unchecked aggression to fester under your watch. The resulting infection is yours to manage. Vanguard will be transitioning our security needs to a competitor by Monday morning. Do not attempt to contact my office regarding this matter again." David ended the call, slipping the phone into the pocket of his hoodie, just as the heavy cabin doors sealed shut with a decisive thud. The engines of the massive Boeing 777 spooled up, a low, powerful vibration that resonated through the floorboards. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, David looked out the window. Down on the tarmac, illuminated by the harsh orange glow of the sodium lights, he could see the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers still parked near the terminal exit. They were loading Thomas Briggs into the back of a squad car, a highly visible, humiliating end to a career built on cruelty and intimidation. The hard karma was complete. The authority Thomas had weaponized against vulnerable passengers had been entirely dismantled by the ultimate hidden authority. The predator had unwittingly cornered a lion, and the resulting destruction of his professional life was absolute. As the plane rocketed down the runway and lifted gracefully into the dark Chicago sky, David finally opened his notebook. The chaos of the ground faded away, replaced by the serene, isolated quiet of the stratosphere. He had a great deal of work to do before they landed in London, but for the first time that day he felt a profound sense of satisfaction. By the time Vanguard Flight 882 touched down on the rain-slicked tarmac of London Heathrow Airport 8 hours later, the entire commercial aviation industry had been turned completely upside down. Corporate news moved with astonishing speed, but a scandal involving a billionaire venture capitalist taking down a corrupt system from the inside moved with explosive, unstoppable velocity. While David Carmichael had been sleeping comfortably in his lie-flat suite somewhere high over the Atlantic Ocean, his aggressive public relations team back in New York City had been working relentlessly. They had intentionally leaked the detailed security footage and the verified facts of the incident at Gate C-14 to several major financial publications and aviation news outlets. When David stepped off the aircraft and walked through the private VIP customs terminal, his smartphone instantly vibrated with dozens of frantic notifications. A digital headline on the Wall Street Journal read, "Undercover Odnia, Clean House, Vanguard Airlines purchaser, Fire Airlines purchaser fires rogue agent in dramatic terminal showdown." The Aviation Daily led with an even more aggressive title, "Billion ARR's Hard Karma: How One Bigoted Gate Agent Accidentally Dismantled a National Security Contract." The ripple effect of David's absolute refusal to tolerate systemic prejudice was massive, immediate, and utterly devastating to those who had abused their power. Back in Chicago, the morning sun offered no warmth for Thomas Briggs. He had spent the entire night curled on a hard metal bench in a holding cell at the Chicago Police Department precinct. Denied bail due to the severity of the corporate identity theft charges and the involvement of federal aviation security protocols, he was facing a terrifying mountain of legal trouble. The union, terrified of the catastrophic public relations nightmare and the boundless legal wrath of the new airline owner, had officially and publicly abandoned him. Thomas was looking at potential federal prison time for fraudulently operating a security checkpoint under a false identity, compounded by egregious civil rights violations. The arrogant, untouchable gatekeeper was now just another frightened, shivering inmate wearing a bright orange jumpsuit, completely stripped of the petty authority he had wielded like a club. Officer Gregory Larson and his overly eager partner had fared absolutely no better. Terminated before the London-bound flight had even reached its cruising altitude, they found themselves completely blacklisted from the private security industry. The catastrophic loss of the Vanguard contract had sent Aegis Terminal Solutions into an uncontrollable financial freefall, dropping their stock price by 40% at the opening bell. Panicking company executives held a televised press conference and publicly blamed Larson for the financial disaster, throwing him completely under the bus to appease their furious shareholders. Stripped of their badges, their tactical vests, and their pensions, the two men were left to navigate the harsh reality of the unemployment line, their tough guy personas entirely shattered by one fatal miscalculation. But the ripples sent outward by David Carmichael were not exclusively destructive. They were also profoundly restorative for the people who actually deserved it. At O'Hare Terminal 3, Chloe arrived for her Saturday morning shift with a heavy heart, fully expecting a chaotic day of dealing with corporate fallout and angry managers. Instead, she was warmly greeted by the chief station manager, Sarah Jenkins, who escorted her away from the crowded gate and into a pristine private office overlooking the sunlit tarmac. True to David Carmichael's explicit word, Chloe was handed a new gold-plated badge, a significant salary increase, and the official title of Senior Gate Supervisor. The toxic, fear-based environment created by Thomas Briggs was instantly eradicated. It was replaced by Chloe's inherent kindness, her strict adherence to genuine customer care, and a newfound sense of safety among the ground staff. In Atlanta, Richard Hughes and the corporate executive board initiated a massive sweeping audit of all gate personnel across the global Vanguard network. They implemented strict new anti-discrimination protocols overnight, tying management bonuses directly to civil rights compliance. The culture of the airline shifted in a matter of hours. The lingering fear of encountering the undercover owner terrified the bad actors into submission, while simultaneously empowering the good employees to finally speak up without fear of workplace retaliation. David Carmichael rode in the quiet, luxurious backseat of the black executive sedan, watching the historic, rain-washed architecture of London roll past the tinted windows. He was exhausted from the long journey, but his mind was remarkably clear and focused. He had originally purchased Vanguard Airlines as a purely financial investment, a calculated move to diversify his massive portfolio. But the ugly incident at Gate C-14 had transformed the corporate acquisition into a strict, moral imperative. He had experienced firsthand how easily power could be abused by those who felt completely insulated from consequences. It was a stark, visceral reminder that true corporate leadership was not merely about maximizing quarterly profits in an isolated boardroom. It was about ensuring that the most vulnerable person in the room was treated with the exact same dignity as the wealthiest executive. As the sedan pulled up to the imposing glass doors of his London corporate headquarters, David checked his reflection in the dark window. He was still wearing the simple, unassuming dark grey hoodie. He smiled, a quiet, knowing expression settling over his features. He had successfully proven that genuine respect was not commanded by a flashy uniform, a contrived title, or the exorbitant price tag of a tailored suit. True respect was earned through decisive action, unwavering integrity, and the absolute willingness to stand immovable in the face of blatant injustice. Thomas Briggs had aggressively targeted a black passenger, assuming he had easily found a helpless victim to humiliate for his own amusement. Instead, he had unwittingly summoned a Category 5 hurricane that swept away his corruption, permanently leveled the playing field, and reminded the entire world that hard karma rarely ever misses its mark. The story of David Carmichael and the dramatic takedown at Gate C-14 proves that true power doesn't need to shout to be heard, and that justice, when delivered with precision, is the ultimate form of hard karma. We hope you were captivated by this intense tale of corporate retribution, hidden authority, and the deeply satisfying moment when a bully finally faces the devastating consequences of their own arrogance. If you enjoyed this story of an undercover billionaire completely dismantling systemic injustice from the ground up, please do us a huge favor. Hit that like button to show your support. Share this story with your friends who love a brilliant plot twist. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, high-stakes narratives delivered right to your feed. Drop a comment below telling us what you would have done in David's shoes. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for our next story.